Yes, folks, the pleasing mildness of a camel is just as enjoyable to a doctor as it is to you or me. In a nationwide survey, doctors in all branches of medicine were asked, "What cigarette do you smoke, doctor?" The brand named most was Camel's. Tens of thousands of doctors, general practitioners, surgeons, specialists, doctors in every branch of medicine were included. And according to this nationwide survey, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette.
Come with me if you want to live. Come on! Listen and understand that Terminator is out there. It can't be bargained with. It can't be reasoned with. It doesn't feel pity or remorse or fear. And it absolutely will not stop. Ever. Until you are dead.
Viene una tormenta!
What did he just say?
He said there's a storm coming in.
I know.
I keep thinking about this problem of how we can know that everything we believe about reality is not just our imagination. I realize it doesn't matter. If everything we believe is just our imagination, there would be no way to prove that it's not. Likewise, even if everything we believe is as the sane believe it to be, we can't prove that it's not our imagination. At some point, you've just got to give common sense a seat on the carriage and move on. I mention this again only because it is almost like we're living in a reality show. If we overlaid the format of a typical reality show onto what is being generated by information sources and amplified in social media, you'd be hard-pressed to make a case that the way people are reacting to what they believe to be reality is any different from the way they could be expected to react to reality programming. The goal of reality television, obviously, is to sell soap, liquor, and cars. It does this with time-tested and predictable techniques to hold the attention of the audience from episode to episode. It is essential that the people are distracted from their problems and invest emotionally in the outcome of the put-on. And so it is with Trump's new show, which we could call This Time He's Gone Too Far. Much of the public is distracted. Much of the public is riveted by what Trump might say or do next, mortified, outraged, or amused by what he has said or done, and hopeful or worried about what his enemies might do. The belief that Trump is a bad president is widely held. It is, however, flat wrong. Furthermore, the people who indulge in the fantasy that if Trump is impeached, everything will be unicorns and rainbows are the proverbial camel sticking his head in the sand. Examination of the reality on which we all should be able to agree proves that Trump is doing an excellent job. Indeed, his job performance is even more spectacular than his audacious bragging can convey. This is the hard truth in a time in which the middle class is underpaid and overtaxed. This is the hard truth in a time in which the global economy is unstable and on the verge of collapse. This is the hard truth in a time in which expanding wars of aggression are threatening mankind in every corner of the earth. This is the hard truth in a time in which the ordinary metrics of presidential job performance should rate Trump as a failure. Unfortunately, the government is wholly captured by the rich, and the indisputable fact is that the rich are coming out ahead under Trump, just as they did under Obama, Clinton, and the two Bushes, and just as they would have under Hillary or anyone else. The rich have their tax cuts, amnesty for offshore tax evasion, an increase in the war budget, protection of medical industry profits, a steady stream of establishment judges, and for purposes of this presentation, an extraordinary acceleration of the deregulation of industry. Let's not ask whether things would be different if more people left the theater to have a look at what's going on outside while the show is on. Instead, let's go back in time. About 100 years ago, Henry Ford had a large cash surplus from the sales of his Model T. He wanted to return some of this money to his community through higher wages for his workers and lower prices for his customers. Some of the company shareholders sued him and argued that the money belonged to the shareholders and that Ford had no right to divert the profits for public benefit. The case reached the Michigan Supreme Court in 1919. The court ruled that the business of a corporation is carried on for the benefit and profit of the shareholders. The court ruled that a corporation does not have the right to distribute profits for any other purpose. This ruling created an article of legal faith that a corporation has only one purpose: to make a profit for its shareholders. Moreover, history has shown that the larger a corporation gets, the less it can be bargained with or reasoned with, and the less it will feel pity or remorse or fear. One industry whose players exemplify this guiding principle of corporate governance is wireless telecommunications. You may have seen reports that the industry is transitioning from 4G to 5G. The G stands for generation, so the transition is from 4th generation to 5th generation. 4G operates on wavelength frequencies below 6 GHz. 5G will operate on wavelength frequencies between 30 and 300 GHz. The 5G frequency range is extremely high and will support more devices per square meter, but it will require more antennas. 5G will offer speeds 20 times faster than 4G. With 5G in place, the wireless telecommunications companies will be able to compete with the cable companies for internet and streaming services without having to incur the cost of installing and maintaining cable lines. In addition, the wireless communications companies will be able to mine and market customer data. To demonstrate how lucrative the wireless telecommunications business is and why it provokes so much greed, we can start with the last census. As you can see, in 2010, there were approximately 250 million people over the age of 16 in the United States. A recent study has found that 95% of the public over the age of 18 has a cell phone, and of these, 77% are smartphones. It is not difficult to imagine that these gaps will be filled soon. Life seems to be getting more difficult without a smartphone, so that it is likely that we will see nearly 100% market penetration within a few years. Thus, if we assume that each of the 250 million people over the age of 16 has a cell phone, and that the average monthly bill is $100, the wireless communications companies are collecting about $25 billion per month, even before they start bundling other products, such as home internet and video streaming. This works out to about $300 billion per year. AT&T has quarterly revenues of $39 billion, which is about $160 billion per year. Cell phone service is only part of their business, but whatever percentage it is a lucrative enterprise for AT&T. Buried in the middle of the newspaper are the growing number of reports of the danger that radio frequency radiation from cell phones poses to health. We now have studies which link brain cancers and tumors of the acoustic nerve to cell phone use. In addition, we have reports that radio frequency radiation causes headaches, memory and learning difficulties, sleep disturbance, depression, balance issues, disruption of the immune system, and lower sperm counts. There are even studies which suggest that radio frequency radiation alters DNA. The FCC has warned that studies have shown that the eyes and testes are particularly vulnerable to radio frequency radiation because of the relative lack of available blood flow to dissipate the excessive heat load. In March 2018, the results of a major study by the National Toxicology Program were announced. The National Toxicology Program is an interagency program run by the United States Department of Health and Human Services to coordinate, evaluate, and report on toxicology within public agencies. The study reported, among other things, that the scientists had found clear evidence that radio frequency radiation from cell phones increases the incidence of brain cancer and heart tumors in lab rats. These studies are not a huge surprise. As early as 2010, studies had been piling up that people who use a cell phone are twice as likely to develop brain cancer as those who don't, and that the risk increases with talk time and number of calls. Indeed, radio frequency radiation is such a known risk to human health that the military has weapons which use it against hostile forces.
That millimeter wave energy comes out an aperture underneath the main reflector, hits the subreflector, which illuminates that main reflector, and sends a roughly antenna-sized beam downrange.
The electromagnetic radiation released by the active denial system is similar to the microwaves in your microwave oven, in that it causes the water molecules in the target to become excited and heat up. It does this by outputting only the carefully chosen radio wave frequency of 95 gigahertz. Even though it can easily penetrate clothing, the ADS generates a much shorter and safer wavelength of radio waves than those used in microwave ovens.
The FCC regulates the limits of radio frequency radiation. These limits are published in the Code of Federal Regulations and are made available in various bulletins. The FCC generally follows the guidelines and recommendations of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers on safe levels of radio frequency radiation between 3 kHz and 300 GHz. The recommendation is difficult to understand in the abstract. The point is that the higher the frequency of the wave, the farther away you should be. Further, the recommendations are based on short exposures, 30 minutes for general uncontrolled exposure and 6 minutes for controlled occupational exposure. In addition, it is particularly important to reduce exposure at wavelengths higher than 3 GHz because of the potential for eye damage. Radio frequency radiation is measured in picowatts per square meter. The IEEE holds that when picowatts per square meter is between 10 and 1,000, the risk to health is severe. When the level is above 1,000, the risk is extreme. I have marked 1,000 on this meter. Palo Alto, California is ground zero for the wireless telecommunications business. It is in the heart of Silicon Valley, and it is home to Steve Jobs' personal Apple store. Last year, the wireless telecommunications companies rammed a new 4G program through the town council. This was the first step in implementing 5G. The program consisted of providing blanket coverage of 4G service with a system of small antennas in the commercial district near Stanford University. This system moves the cell phone antennas much closer to the public. The antenna is fairly discreet. You can see it here mounted near the top of the lamppost. It is right about where the second story of most buildings are. As a result, if you have children sleeping upstairs near one of these antennas, you should expect them to have some serious health consequences. In fact, I have seen reports that the value of property near these antennas is dropping as people are moving. Here is a close-up of the antenna itself. The green box next to the lamppost is not a mailbox. Instead, it is the power station, and it gives off a tremendous amount of electromagnetic radiation. It could be argued that the power station is disguised as a mailbox to blend into the neighborhood. But my sense is that it is part of a conscious deception being perpetrated on the public. After all, who's afraid of a mailbox? Incidentally, wireless telecommunications requires 10 times the power of wired technology, so that it results in more pollution. Here is a shot of the bus stop we saw earlier. You can see in the foreground the same arrangement of a 4G antenna on a lamppost next to the power station disguised as a mailbox. This is the meter reading near the bus stop. As you can see in the LCD display, the average output is over 1,000 picowatts per square meter. The scientific community has determined that this is an extreme risk. It is difficult to see the LCD in this reading near the antenna. The average output is around 3,000 picowatts per square meter. The light is easier to see, and you can see that it does not drop below 2,500, which is 2.5 times the level of extreme risk. Obviously, with the amount of money involved, we cannot expect the wireless telecommunication companies to bargain or reason or feel pity or remorse or fear. Their only concern is pushback from the public, and there are two major prongs to the counterattack. First, they have adopted the strategy of the tobacco companies. For years, the tobacco companies knew that they could not win the argument whether or not smoking is unhealthy. As a result, their objective was simply to keep the argument going. The lack of certainty is reassuring to the consumer who is biased in favor of the device. In this case, it is the cell phone and faster internet speeds. Here is an excerpt from an internal tobacco industry memo which was discovered in the course of litigation. The strategy is obvious. Doubt is our product, since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public. Compare that with the official position of the Cellular, Telecommunications, and Internet Association. The scientific evidence shows no known health risk due to the RF energy emitted by cell phones. Similarly, here is the response of the GSM Association to the National Toxicology Program report from earlier this year that radio frequency radiation causes brain cancer and heart tumors. The study found that there is no established health risk from radio signals that comply with international safety recommendations. Here is part of the response of CTIA to the report from 2010 of the link between cell phone use and brain cancer. The study found no overall increased risk of brain cancer, and this is consistent with conclusions reached in an already large body of research on this subject. Nor is this strategy newly adopted. In 1994, Motorola initiated a PR campaign that would argue that there are too many uncertainties related to the methodology, the findings, and the science to draw any conclusions about the risk of cell phones. Second, the wireless telecommunications companies have bought the government. It is notorious that in 1996, Bill Clinton signed the Telecommunications Act into law, and that this law permitted communication companies to consolidate across media. As a consequence of this law, media is now a monopoly. A lesser-known provision is buried in Section 332 of Title 47 of the United States Code. This provides that no state or local government may regulate the installation of cell phone antennas on the basis of environmental risks related to radio frequency radiation, provided that the installation complies with federal regulations. What this means is that local communities have no legal right to object to the installation of wireless telecommunication equipment based on the health and safety risk it poses. The will of the people is irrelevant, and the science does not matter. Indeed, the Harvard Center for Ethics found that the FCC is a captured agency in that it is controlled by the industry it is supposed to regulate. They found that the FCC grants the wireless industry pretty much whatever it wants. In exchange, the wireless industry, including AT&T, spends about $45 million per year on lobbying. The chairman of the FCC is Ajit Pai. For those of you concerned that there is not enough bipartisanship in D.C., take note that he was appointed by Obama and then reappointed by Trump, and he was confirmed by a unanimous vote of the Senate. His resume highlights what the Harvard Center for Ethics means by a captured agency. As you can see, one of his earlier jobs was as a lawyer for Verizon. The official position of the United States government is that while some researchers have reported biological changes associated with RF energy, these studies have failed to be replicated. The majority of the studies have failed to show an association between exposure to radio frequency radiation and health problems. The cell phone and wireless business dwarf the tobacco industry even at its peak. The people are in a huge fight, and most don't even realize it. Further, the tools we have are primitive and handicapped compared with the enemy's. However, at least the California Department of Public Health issued guidelines to reduce exposure to radio frequency radiation from cell phones. These suggestions include keeping the phone away from the body, reducing cell phone use when the signal is weak, reduce the use of cell phones for streaming services or to upload or download large files, and keeping the phone away from the bed at night. These suggestions are only the smallest first step. We are faced with a known risk. Sadly, we know how this show ends unless we engage and fight back.
Ladies and gentlemen, the late Yul Brynner.
I really wanted to make a commercial when I discovered that I was that sick and my time was so limited. I wanted to make that commercial that says simply, now that I'm gone, I tell you, don't smoke. Whatever you do, just don't smoke. If I could take back that smoking, we wouldn't be talking about any cancer. I'm convinced of that.